Es una tesis y normalmente cuando el candidato termina su presentación es verdad que en seminarios aplaudimos y todo. Pero aquí esperaremos, si no les parece mal, hasta que acabe todo lo que es la parte de preguntas, la deliberación de los miembros del tribunal, para verificar si es que se ha solicitado al candidato. Esperemos que sí vaya. O sea, no interrumpimos, acabamos la presentación, seguimos con el debate de los miembros del tribunal. Les pediremos, ¿no?, a todos ustedes, bueno, sé lo que doctor en la sala tendrá la oportunidad de hacer una pregunta o varias preguntas si quieren, y después les pediremos que abandonen la sala para deliberar nosotros y después podemos volver cuando ya tengamos el resultado de la deliberación. Y en ese momento, pues en función del resultado y cómo haya ido todo, pues ya sí que felicitaremos al candidato. Okay, so you can start everyone.
Okay, thank you. You can share the screen, so if you don't mind, can you confirm that you are watching the slides?
Yes, perfect.
Daniel, okay. Javier?
Perfect, too. I can see it.
Okay,
great. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Carmen, and thank you, the tribunal, as well. Thank you, all of you. To me, it's quite fascinating that after 4 years, I could finally say conditions from a numerical and experimental perspective, okay? From a numerical and experimental perspective, okay? Basically, this has been the work that I've done within my PhD, and the main message that I would like to transmit to you today is that crowd research is cool. I mean, crowds are a very interesting and fascinating system on which we can address several research questions. And I would like to present you some of these questions today. So, to start with a little bit of context, the first question that we should answer is why do we study pedestrian dynamics, right? So, for me, the most straightforward reason is because pedestrian dynamics is interesting from an applied point of view. Trying to understand the different types of behavior that a pedestrian system could have seems to be essential when it comes to provide a good crowd management. So, just as an appetite, for instance, we can study how congestions in airports are formed and what can we do in order to prevent the congestion. Or more, in a normal situation, we can study how people walk and interact with the environment, so as to adapt or trying to adapt this environment accordingly and hence improving walking comfort. And probably the most important situations are mass events like this, when you have a lot of people gathered in the same place and at the same time. And these particular situations are interesting because accidents are not likely to happen. In fact, over the last 50 years of crowd research, we can extract two clear messages from this graph. The first one is that the number of incidents are increasing in frequency. So here the frequency of circles is higher than here. And also the number of people involved in these incidents are increasing as well. So in some way, these incidents are becoming more deadly, so to say. So that's basically the context of my theme and why it's important to study pedestrian dynamics. But also, for my particular case as a physicist, we are interested in pedestrian dynamics because we can conceptualize a pedestrian system, a crowd as a complex system, right? More precisely, we can think of a crowd as a group of individuals, okay, namely pedestrians, and these pedestrians interact not only with the environment, but also with the rest of pedestrians, the local neighbors. That's giving rise to local interactions. And these local interactions will go from long-range interactions, a more social nature, to short-range interactions with a more physical sense. Okay. But the funny thing here is that my neighbors have also their own neighbors, and the neighbors of my neighbors have also their own neighbors. So eventually, we end up with a sort of complex interaction network in which every little perturbation can propagate over the whole system, thus giving rise to a collective behavior. And these are actually the features of a complex system, and why we can think of a crowd like this. There are different factors that could affect the nature of these local interactions and the emergence of the collective behavior. And for the particular case of my thesis, one of the key factors is the density, the number of people in a certain region. And it's funny because when I started working in my PhD, I initially focused on this particular region, namely high-density scenarios, where clearly the short-range interactions dominate the dynamical response, and more precisely the physical contacts. Okay. But at the heart of my PhD, with the arrival of the COVID-19 pandemic, I had to jump to the diametrically opposed density region, namely low density scenarios, where this time it is the long-range interactions which dominate. Right, high density scenarios, namely room evacuation process. and how the effect of an obstacle or a physical barrier could affect the dynamics in such systems. Then I will move to low-density scenarios driven by the COVID-19 pandemic and how the imposition of safety distance prescription may affect the way people move. And finally, I would like to end with a pretty interesting result related with the previous experimental scenario that was about a self-organization process. That being said, let's do the room evacuation. So we can define a room evacuation as a situation when you have a group of people that have to exit from a specific place because of safety reasons, right? And this process can be done in an either relaxed way or in a rush. So we can define different levels of competitiveness. Usually, we understand competitiveness as the eagerness to exit. Or in other words, the higher the competitiveness is, the more likely it will be to find faster pedestrians, more intense interactions between them, and eventually the periods of physical contacts and higher pressures. And on this point, one of the, let's say, pioneers' work done by Helvin and co-workers, and it was a numerical study where the authors were able to identify a key feature that characterized room evacuations. And they call it faster is slower phenomenon. This notion basically states that the faster you want to get out from a room, the more time you will need to get out through the door. Okay. So a good strategy to prevent the formation of such effect, and also proposed by these authors, was trying to reduce somehow the pressure in front of the door. Okay. And in fact, they propose the use of obstacles or physical barriers located in positions close to the exit, just to alleviate the development of battle pressures and hence improving the evacuation. So, in fact, the same authors performed a mock experiment with some pedestrians and many obstacles, and they actually found that when the obstacle was present, the evacuation was less. Okay. So with these ideas in mind, before I came into the group, my research team wanted to, so to say, better characterize in a more systematically way how the effect of an obstacle could affect the dynamics in evacuation process. And to do so, they performed 3 different sets of experiments. All of them with the students and 1 extra with militaries. And in all of them, they tested different experimental conditions. They performed some experiments under low competitiveness and high competitiveness. Okay, so for the low competitiveness, they asked the volunteers to behave, so to say, politely, in the sense that push was not allowed. And for the high competitiveness scenario, they allowed people to push. Okay, so they behave more competitive. And they also tested some experiments without obstacle and some others with obstacle. So the first thing that they compute was the flow rate. Basically to check whether the hypothesis suggested by Helvin, that was to see if the obstacle improves the evacuation, they compute the flow rate by using what is called the head times. And this variable basically measures the egress time between 2 consecutive pedestrians. Right, so they initially compared the no-obstacle case, the no pushing or the low competitiveness and high competitiveness scenario, finding that for the later, the head times were higher. Or in other words, the higher the competitiveness was, the higher the head times were as well. Okay, so in some way, they were observing the faster is slower phenomenon experimental. When they include the obstacle, things were a little bit tricky because they realized that regardless of the distance between the obstacle and the door, these long blocks were still there. And the distributions actually of the head times were rather similar. So, in conclusion, they realized that the obstacle, at least for this experimental scenario, didn't improve nor worsen the outcome. Here is when I get into the group, and we keep working on this experimental scenario, but we wanted to characterize this time the collective dynamics. And to do so, we start with the no obstacle case by computing the density fields. So, we initially found that a substantial degree of confinement for the no obstacle case, a substantial degree of confinement has been reached with density values higher than 8 pedestrians per square meter. For the velocity fields, we identify that those positions in the laterals, or compared with those in front of the exit, present lower velocity values. And for the exit times, actually the scale exit time, because We not only take into account the exit time, but rescale it by the initial position of the area. So we confirm that the positions in the laterals, both in the spatial distributions and also in the angular histogram, present higher exit time values. But when we include obstacles, things dramatically change, or more precisely, the spatial distribution of the maps were altered. For the density fields, this time we identify a region of low densities, one in front of the obstacle and one behind the obstacle, whereas in the laterals, the density dramatically increased. For the velocity fields, we see that the obstacle creates a region of high velocities in front of the exit. And now for the exit times, it seems that the opposite trend, almost the opposite trend compared with the non-obstacle case is observed. Namely, this time the positions in the laterals present higher exit time values than those in front of the exit, as we can see here in the angular histogram. So to sum up, we are confirming that the fields are different, but the flow is identical. So it induces us to think that maybe the flow response is locally regulated at the very exit. To further explore this issue, we get access for the first time to the pressure behavior. Okay, so basically we had a pressure of matrix of pressure sensors, which allow us to get access to the forces exerted by pedestrians on the walls. Okay, while they were going now. Just to give you an idea of what type of data we have, basically it was a digital signal. Okay, that after calibration we can convert into pressure measurements. So with this data, we initially compute the average temporal series of the pressure. So here, the gray line corresponds to each trial individually, whereas the red line corresponds to the average over the whole repetitions performed for each experimental condition. Right? So the first thing that we notice is that the pressure values present high fluctuations, but at least for the non-obstacle case, and by comparing the low competitiveness and high competitiveness scenario, we can identify that when the competitiveness was higher, the pressure values were higher as well. Okay, but now when we include the obstacle, things were a little bit different because the presence of this physical barrier seems to systematically reduce the mean pressure registers. Okay, and this effect is more visible when the obstacle is closer to the exit and when it's farther. However, we are also interested not only on the average behavior, but also in the extreme events, okay? High pressure values. And normally the average of the data does not display such behavior. So that's why instead of using the mean temporal series, we use the cumulative distribution function, okay? Or the survival function. And if we display this distribution against all the experimental conditions, we observe that we compare, for instance, the black curve with the red one. We see that the probability of finding high pressure values is reduced when the obstacle was present. Okay. So in short, we have seen that the pressure is actually reduced when the obstacle is present, but this is not translated into a flow improvement. So why this was happening? Our last step on this topic was trying to correlate the lower pressure values with the flowing condition. And to do so, we had access to the head time values between two consecutive pedestrians, and during these time lapse, the pressure registered at that time. Okay, so we based on these delta values, we create a sort of classification criteria, going from what we understand a flowing condition with low delta values to a clock situation with high delta values, and depending on this classification criteria, we use as an input the different local registers, the different pressure registers. And we now compute, again, the same cumulative distributions, we observe the following behavior. For the non-obstacle case, it seems that there isn't any correlation between the flowing condition and the pressure registers. Okay, so there is a collapse because of the delta T values. However, when we include the obstacles, things were a little bit different because this time the green lines corresponding to a situation of clock, a clock situation of delta T values higher, presents a higher probability of develop higher pressure values. Or in other words, actually this trend is more visible again as the obstacle is closer to the exit. So in short, we can conclude that the development of high pressures seems to be linked with the development of clocks, but only when the obstacle was present. As we have seen, during these previous slides, there are several open questions to be answered. And probably one of the most important one is why the obstacle is not improving the flow. And I know that we can discuss and give several reasons, but I try to sum up it in two particular reasons. The first one could be because of geometrical factors. So I truly think that the interaction between pedestrians and the obstacle is making that the body orientation of pedestrians are, so to say, unnatural. So for instance, if we pay attention to this guy, is with his back pointing to the exit. So in some way, it seems that even though the obstacle is reducing the pressure at the door, it is also making the evacuation process less orderly. And also it could be because of psychological factors, because we don't have to forget that the obstacle could have strong screening effects on pedestrians. So essentially, when you see an obstacle as a pedestrian, you don't want to go straight to it, but instead avoid it somehow. Okay, and these avoidance maneuvers could explain why the obstacle effect is minimized. So with all this background, we keep working on evacuation process and changing the perspective from the experiments to a numerical framework. Okay, and the idea with it was trying to develop a numerical model as faithful as possible to the experimental scenario. And on this point, one of the most celebrated models on this realm was the one performed by Helbing and co-workers that is usually called the social force model. Helbing basically thought that he could modulate the behavior of pedestrians as a sort of Newton's second law. Okay, and they actually proposed a Newton's second law applied for people, where the movement of the agents will be governed by the sum of different forces. A propulsion force, which makes the agent go to a specific direction and at a certain velocity. A social force, in order to make the agents keep a certain interpersonal distance. A contact force, to prevent overlaps between agents and to take into account the actual human restriction of human bodies. And finally, fluctuations because of the environment. So this model, even though it has successfully reproduced several pedestrian behaviors, it has also some limitations. And in fact, before I came into the group, my research team and collaborators started developing a new numerical approach, and they wanted to overcome two particular limitations of the Helbing model. The first one was related with the social force, and to illustrate this idea, let me highlight these two eyes here. Because, to be honest, it doesn't make sense that these guys are feeling any sort of social force, or in other words, they don't want to keep any interpersonal distance between them. They just want to get out of the room as soon as possible, and they don't care if they are keeping any distance between them. They don't care if they are in a contact situation. So that's why, at least for this particular experiment, our numerical model does not have to include a social component and remove this term from the equation. The second one was related with rotation. After realizing that the rotation was playing a key role in the dynamical response of our system. So we have to be really careful when choosing a properly shape for our simulated agents. Okay? Since we want to be as close as possible to our experimental scenario, we have to be also as close as possible to the real human shape. Okay? To obtain similar results. So that's why we avoid using the circular shape, as is commonly used in the literature, and instead we propose an spherocylindrical shape. And with these two new updates, we propose the movement of pedestrians as a sum of translational and rotational movement. For the translational movement, it was composed of two terms. A propulsion term, which will be characterized by this BD parameter that we usually call desired speed. So essentially, this takes into account the competitiveness in our system. The higher the desired speed, the more competitiveness it will be in the system. And finally, contact forces between agents. And for the rotational movement, let me get into more details because, again, we have two terms, a contact torque, that result because of the contact forces, a natural torque in physics. And then a propulsion torque, that for me is the most important ingredient in this model. Because this element tries to mimic the intrinsic desire of pedestrians to walk transversally to the moving direction. Or in other words, pedestrians usually walk with a higher cross-section, okay, in the direction of movement. So that's why it makes sense that our spherocylinders will be oriented with the long axis transversal to the moving direction. So that's why this term is proportional to the angular deviation between the desired orientation and the moving direction. And it is modulated by this S sub d parameter that we usually call angular strength. So just to give you a visual idea of how these things works, if this angular strength is greater than 0, it will make the agent to be oriented transversally to the moving direction, whereas if it's just 0, the particle don't care how to be oriented while moving. Okay, so with this new numerical framework, we perform some simulations with obstacle and some others with obstacle, and varying also the level of competitiveness in our system. So we initially start with a referential case, so no include a referential orientation for the particles, meaning the angular strength equals to 0, and this is the referential case of the referential outflow for the obstacle case. If we now start introducing the obstacle at different distance, we see that the following thing: that if the obstacle is really close to the exit, the evacuation gets worse. Okay, so the obstacle does not improve. However, if we move the obstacle slightly farther, we found a distance at which the obstacle makes the flow gets better. And finally, we place the obstacle farther away, we can see, or we like to the asymptotic case of the no obstacle. And the same trend is observed regardless of the competitiveness imposed in the system. So it doesn't matter if you include higher design speed values or lower speed values. But the funny thing here is that we had previously seen the same behavior in other systems, actually granular systems. Okay, so it seems that we are more close to a granular system than to our real human system, and it could be because we are not introducing any desired orientation in our simulated agents. So what would happen if we now include this orientation in our agents? Are we going to still find an optimal position or a distance at which the obstacle improves the flow or not? So that's why in the following I will focus only in this particular region, okay, of distance, and simulate perform new simulations. At this time, adding the referential orientation. So this is our referential case with no obstacle and different levels of competitiveness. And if we now include the obstacle case at this specific region, we are still watching that the obstacle makes the flow gets better. So our conclusion is that still we are not reproducing the experimental and something is missing in our numerical proposal. To conclude this high density regime part, we have seen that from the experiments the obstacle that seems that does not improve the flow neither worsen. But it has some positive effects like reducing the pressure in front of the door and alter the collective dynamics. And for the simulations, we have proposed a new numerical framework, giving so many importance to the particle shape in order to properly propose a good rotational mechanism. But however, regardless of the orientational mechanism that we impose in the particles, we always find a distance at which the obstacle makes the flows better. So from both blocks of works, we can, for the future, it would be nice to, from the experimental part, perform new experiments in which we can actually access to the real orientation of pedestrians. And this will be a really good input for the numerical model, because in this way we can propose a new orientational mechanism, but this time with a more physically ground sense, okay, based on experimental findings. So in principle, in normal conditions, I could have continued working on this topic, but as I told you, things dramatically change for us. And that's why we have to jump from high density scenarios to low density ones. That's what I said. Okay, so we jump from the high density scenarios to low density ones, basically because gathering big groups of people were not allowed anymore, and a new social paradigm emerged in our society. But this new social paradigm brought also new research line topics. And for the particular case of pedestrian dynamics, more of the research lines were focused on this particular rule, okay, trying to maintain a physical distance. So with this idea, in our group, a question started to arise, mainly because no one had previously checked whether if people were going to be able to respect the social distancing and study this type of things. So we were the first to we start asking ourselves, okay, when we move, are we really able to respect the social distance, even being aware of having to do so? And this point is actually important. I'll come back to it later because it has a really important nuance. Okay, so our answer was let's do an experiment. And the main idea with it was gathering small groups of people and ask them to walk with the rest while trying to keep a prescribed safety distance. So the experimental scenario that we used was rather simple, just a rectangular area, and we explored 3 different parameters. The first one, and probably the most logical one, is the global density, number of people inside, testing from 12 pedestrians inside to 32 pedestrians. Also, we performed some experiments in which we asked volunteers to walk fast, and some others in which we asked them to walk slow. And finally, we wanted to see whether it was any difference if we asked them to maintain 1.5 meters or 2 meters. So let me show you one example, just to give you a visual idea. Each experiment consisted of 3 random places, in which we simply asked pedestrians to walk randomly inside the arena, with no further explanations. But highlight this, we asked them to try to do your best, in the sense that they must, as good as they could, to try to keep the interpersonal distance. Between each random phase, there was one phase towards the wall, okay? In which they have to go to one of the 4 walls, touch it at any place, and start the new random phase. Okay, and this strategy was done in an attempt to prevent the formation of collective movements. So later we will see how things was. And finally, every evacuation process finished with an exit process. So we tested different experimental conditions and performed several repetitions for each experiment. And from now on, all the experiments that I will show you in the following will be only focused on this particular phase, random phase, right? So let's see how the different parameters affect the fulfillment of the interpersonal distance. Starting with the global density effect, here we can see the probability distribution function for the distance to the nearest neighbor, interpersonal distance, for the experiment with just 12 people inside, the less crowded scenario. And here it is our referential case, 2 meters. And we can see that actually the more than half of the area of our distribution is shifted to the left. So it means that the more than 50% of the people for the low crowded scenario has someone at least than 2 meters. As you may imagine, by increasing the number of people inside, this distribution shifts to the left. So the higher the number of people, the shorter the distance were. And what happens if we convert the slow experiments with the fast experiments? The slow experiments here in dot lines, but if we now include the fast experiments in dot lines, we can see that for the later, the distance here has slightly shorter. Okay, so in a sense, asking them to walk fast makes the interpersonal distance be a little bit short. Now, what was better, asking them to respect 1.5 meters or 2 meters? So to be able to compare both the scenarios, we make use of what we call close approaches, that basically measure the time at which 2 pedestrians spend at a distance less than 1 meter. So with 12 pedestrians inside, we can see that there were no close approaches, but as we increase the number of people inside, things start to be a little bit different. Here, for instance, or if we compare this with the slow walking speed experiments, we can see that the circles are always below the squares, meaning that the close approaches, we ask them to maintain 2 meters were reduced. And the same trend is observed if we include the fast experiments, okay? Always the circle below the squares. As we increase the number of people inside, the same trend is observed, but the gap between the circles and the squares are getting higher and higher. Finally, with 32 pedestrians inside, we can see that the number of close approaches is quite high. So we can conclude that it is always better recommending a higher prescribed safety distance because people tend to overestimate the distance we are keeping. Sorry, underestimate the distance we are keeping with the rest of the people. Finally, we wanted to characterize our system macroscopically as well. And to do so, we initially made use of one of the most widely used tools applied in pedestrian dynamics, that is the so-called speed density relation. So just let me introduce a little bit of this notion, because the speed density relation actually came from the traffic field. In a sense, this function informs us that given a specific place in a highway and certain numbers of cars, the velocity at which cars will be able to drive. And if we now translate this notion in the pedestrian field, it's basically the same message. Given a certain density in a region, the velocity at which pedestrians will be able to walk. I'm going to sum up a lot, but essentially we can identify three particular regimes in the speed density relation. The low density regime, in which in principle the speed of pedestrians are not affected by the density. The intermediate or middle range density regime, in which the speed presents a drop in the velocities, mainly because intermittencies start to appear in the system. And finally, the high density regime, in which the system collapses the longer the flow is arrested, and finally the velocity values reach zero. Okay, there are several both experimental and theoretical studies. Here is one of the most famous one. And even though they discuss a lot about the different factors that could affect this speed density relation, they are almost agreed that the trend is mostly like this. Okay. So I will want to notice that since we are working in low density scenarios, we are going to be focused in this particular region. So in principle, we don't expect that the density will affect the velocity of our pedestrians. That being said, we compute the speed density relation of our system by using the Voronoi diagram discretization. And these techniques allow us to access for each pedestrian individually to their local density and local velocity values. And we can do this not only for just one frame, but for several, okay, over a long sampling period. And eventually we end up with a lot like this, with all the individual density and velocity values. And we can study the trend of this cloud with different values, like binding or moving average or whatever, right? So we now apply this technique to all the experimental conditions and compare them, we can find the following indicator. Starting with the fast walking speed experiments, we observe that here different colors correspond to the experiments with different people inside. Okay, so we observe a slight decreasing trend. So actually, the velocity of pedestrians is indeed affected by the local density. Okay, so it's not a plateau. And finally, we observe a collapse between curves. So it seems that the velocity of pedestrians is only affected by the local density, but not by the number of people inside the area. However, when we include the slow walking speed experiments, things were a little bit different, because the first feature that we can identify is that the walking speed fairly determines the velocity regime at which we are working. So we can observe a big jump between the fast walking speed experiments and slow walking speed experiments. I know that this result is quite natural, but it tells us that the walking speed should be included in the description of the experiments. Okay. Also, we are still a slightly decreasing trend, regardless of the density values. And finally, and for me, the most important on this graph that this time, instead of observing a collapse, we are observing gaps between the different curves. Okay. So this tells us that given a certain local density value, the velocity of pedestrians at which pedestrians will be able to walk will be higher as the number of people inside the arena was lower. And just to try to understand, provide a good explanation of this behavior, let me play this video, because it seems that when we impose, or we ask pedestrians to walk slowly, okay, pedestrians are able to not only pay attention to the local environment or to the social surroundings, but also they can identify or develop a global perception in which they can see the system as a whole. Okay, so they are able to identify empty spots, and actually they can reach these spots faster if the number of people in the system is slower, because they have this global perception. So that's why we are observing these gaps between curves. However, when we ask them to walk fast, this global perception disappears. They only have time to pay attention to the local neighbors because the collision time dominates the dynamics, and that's why, regardless of the number of people inside, we are observing a collapse between curves. Also, and like in the evacuation processes, we wanted to characterize the system, we wanted to characterize the corrective dynamics of our system. And to be honest, in principle, we didn't expect anything interesting because, as you may remember, we asked them to just a rather simple instruction, just walk randomly inside the arena, nothing more. But things were a little bit different because when we initially computed the density fields, we observed that even though they occupy the space in a more or less homogeneous way, they develop a tendency to walk closer to the walls. Namely, and this tendency was more visible as the number of people inside was higher. Okay? And for the velocity fields, things were even more interesting because even though we asked them to walk randomly, eventually they develop a sort of circular motion or vortex formation in which they start rotating around the area. And more surprising was that, at least for these maps, all the rotation was occurring in the counterclockwise direction. So this opens my last chapter of this talk, self-organization process. So essentially, we were observing vortex formation, and we wanted to characterize this collective behavior somehow. And to do so, we made use of the angular momentum values with respect to the center of gravity. For each random phase, we calculate an average angular momentum value, and if we now plot this angular momentum value against all the experimental conditions, what we observed was the following graph. That was, to be honest, I'm sorry for this, pretty amazing because it's telling us two clear messages. The first one is that regardless of the experimental conditions, and in all random phases, except one, all the angular momentum values were positive, meaning that the rotation was occurring always in the counterclockwise direction. So it allowed us to say that the symmetry of our system was broken in that direction. And also, we see that it doesn't matter if there were 12 pedestrians or 32 pedestrians inside, the angular momentum values present, or does not depend strongly on the density. Okay, so they present a sort of plateau in their values. So the next natural question was asking ourselves why this was happening. Okay, and the symmetry was broken. So we moved to identify vortex formation in other human systems. And we ended up reading a quite interesting article by Silverberg and co-workers, where the authors find vortex formation in a pretty interesting pedestrian system, namely heavy metal contents. And they actually further study the emergence of such behavior, of such collective behavior, by introducing a numerical model based on the Herbert's ideas, but instead of using a social force, they're using a flocking term. Okay? And with this flocking term, or the time scale of this flocking term dominates over the system, they were able to identify the vortex formation in the numerical models. But the funny thing here was that the proportion in the numerical models of vortex rotating either clockwise or counterclockwise was 50-50, whereas in the real circuits, this proportion goes to 90 for the counterclockwise movement. So Silverberg actually was observing the same symmetry breaking as in our case. So, actually, the authors didn't further explore this curious phenomenon, and they just referenced this neuroscience article that we read. It was interesting because the article analyzed the turning habits of different people in their daily life. And they conclude that right-hand people, when facing a wall, they prefer turning to the left, around 70% of the time. And 85% of our volunteers were right-handed. So this could be a really good hypothesis that explains our experimental findings. So that's why we decided to propose our new numerical model, and we wanted to make it as simple as possible. Okay, so we don't want contacts because we are in a low density conditions, no fluctuations, no flocking term, either nothing more than a propulsion for our particles and a repulsion that will act between pedestrians and between the pedestrians and the wall. And with this, and more precisely, the movement of our particles will be governed by the symmetry forces, a self-propulsion force, like the one I presented you before, and a repulsion force between pedestrians composed of two terms, a long-range term to take into account the physical distancing scenario, and a short-range term that actually never come into play, but it was introduced just to prevent overlaps. And finally, the repulsion against the wall, composed following the same functional shape, but adding a damping term with this idea of reproducing the experimental findings in the density fields, or in other words, that pedestrians have a slight tendency to walk near the walls. So we initially made our model with the interpersonal distance distributions, These are the experimental ones, like the one I showed you before. And if we now include the simulations, the maps was rather good. For the density maps, it seems that at least qualitatively we were able to reproduce the same tendency of the agents to walk close to the walls. And the last question was if our model was able to reproduce vortex formation with these two simple ingredients. And so it was. But the behavior that we encountered was rather interesting because the angular momentum values present a sort of bifurcation with respect to the number of simulated agents that we introduced in the system. So just to clarify this, for instance, if we simulate 8 pedestrians inside, the angular momentum values were around 0, so no vortex formation. Whereas if as we increase the number of people inside, the angular momentum value goes to bifurcate, and we observe the vortex formation. So it seems that the global density here in this system is playing a crucial factor for the vortex formation. However, as in the Silverberg work, we initially didn't observe any sort of symmetry breaking. So the probability of finding the vortex rotating either clockwise or counterclockwise was the same. And let me recall the importance of the damping term in this model, because if we remove this term from the equation, the vortex formation are no longer produced. So just to give you a global idea, or actually a phase diagram, visual phase diagram of my model, we can identify 3 particular regions. The low damping region, in which, regardless of the global density, we never observe vortex formation. The high damping region and high global density region, the high damping and high global density region, in which we always observe vortex formation, but the symmetry is not broken, because we observe either clockwise or counterclockwise vortex. And finally, the transition region, going from high densities to low densities, in which vortex start to be formed as the damping term increases. So still we are not reproducing the symmetry breaking, so we recover this idea of the turning preference of the agents and mimic it as a new turning force that will act between the agents and the walls, right? And for this force we use the same functional set, okay? But we include 2 extra terms: a modulate factor, cosine of alpha, which makes this force be maximum when the particle goes straight to the wall, and minimum this particle moves parallel to the wall or moves away from it. And finally, the direction of this force will be different depending on the turning preference of the particles. Okay, so in other words, it will make the particle to rotate to the left or to the right depending on the turning preference. So the last ingredient here was trying to identify the percentage of right turners and left turners in our experiments, and to do so, we analyze the turning habits of our particular pedestrians. And basically, we identify those pedestrians who fulfill certain conditions. Namely, they have to be isolated, no influence by other pedestrians, and they have to go straight to the walls. And we analyze the type of turn that they perform. Okay, so with this data, we were able to extrapolate the percentage of right turners and left turners and impose the same proportion in our numerical model. And with this, we now rerun some of the same simulations. Here we have the referential case, and if we now include the turning preference, it seems that we obtain really nice results. Because initially, it seems that the model recovers the rotational symmetry, meaning that this time the angular momentum values, all the angular momentum values are positive. Also, the vortex formation seems to not depend strongly on the density. So it doesn't matter if we are simulating either 8 or 32 pedestrians. So there is actually it's not a plateau, but it's not really big difference. And the second point induces us to think the third one. Okay, so since the density is not playing a key role in the dynamical response, it means that the repulsion against pedestrians are not dominating the system, but it is the turning force. And we actually think of this turning force as a sort of small perturbation, because it's not acting in all pedestrians and it's not acting in all pedestrians in the same way, and it's not acting at all times. Okay, so it was good to check that just this small perturbation was dominating the dynamical response. Finally, and this is totally new, we obtained really nice results from the numerical model, but we wanted to check whether the same hypothesis was supported experimentally. So we decided to perform new experiments. And to do so, this time we used a circular arena just to prevent that the geometry of the system plays an important role. And previous to the experiment, we we analyze the turning average of our volunteers. So basically, we ask them to walk to one of the walls and come back again. And depending on the turn that they perform, we create turning groups, left turning groups, and then finally we have a left-hand group for reference. Okay. Here, this photo corresponds to the experiment with only right turners. So if the hypothesis is correct, we are going to obtain a vortex rotating this time in the clockwise direction. But science is not fair sometimes, and this was the result that we obtained. Again, the vortex was formed in the counterclockwise direction. Let me conclude this low density regime. From the physical distancing experiments, we have seen that by increasing the density and the walking speed always leads to more safety distance violations. And it is always better to recommend a higher sky safety distance just to prevent close approaches. For the speed density relation, we have seen that it is not unique. Okay, and not only the local density, but also the global density and the walking speed should be included in the experimental description. And finally, for the vortex formation, we have seen that the confinement imposed in our system could be the reason why vortex are formed, in which surprisingly the symmetry is broken in the counterclockwise direction. And even though from the numerical results we have seen that the turning preference could explain our findings, it is not supported experimentally that the turning preference is the ingredient that explains our experimental findings. So for the future, and this has been a really helix for us over the last months, we are wondering what is the actual interaction that dominates in the system. We wanted to know if it's the pedestrian interactions or actually the pedestrian-pedestrian interactions. So it will be worth for the future. Now I would like to end up with the announcement. So I will start by saying thank you to the Gobierno de España and Asociación de Amigos for the Economical Support and the different projects. Also, and let me switch to Spanish a little bit. Gracias a Raúl y a Iker por este camino de 4 años. Ha sido la verdad un placer compartirlo con vosotros. Me habéis hecho crecer tanto a nivel académico como a nivel personal, y yo es el que más valoro, así que muchas gracias. Muchas gracias al Departamento de Física por haber hecho estas paredes mi casa durante no 4 años, sino que lleva aquí 6, desde que empecé con Diego Marta. A los chicos estudiantes de doctorado por aquí, muchísima suerte, a los nuevos, a los que ya muchos se han ido, han venido a visitarme algunos, muchísimas gracias por todo. Y ya en el terreno personal, a mis amigos tanto de Barcelona, de Zaragoza, han venido incluso de República Dominicana a verme, muchísimas gracias por todo. Y luego a mi familia, que ya decía los agradecimientos que he tenido la suerte de agrandarlo durante los últimos años. Muchas gracias a la representación ostense, Santi, Lorenzo, Alba y a Cristina. Y muchas gracias a mi familia también. Siempre emociona hablar de esto. A mis tíos, a mis tías, en particular a mis padres, por todo. A mi hermano, por la ayuda y por ser la verdad una gran persona. Y a Iñaki por todo. Por ser mi peatón favorito, que quería decirlo. So, thank you all the tribunal as well, and thank you all the collaborators, Daniel Parisi, Cesar, Alexander, Nicolás as well, and thank you all of you for today. I would like to, sorry Carmen, this is actually the last experiment that we performed in a schoolyard, okay? So no, free of boundaries, free of everything, we just ask the students to walk around it. And we are actually, now we are analyzing this behavior just to know whether we can find any bias in the rotation of the system. And now, thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick. So now we will start with the second part, in which the committee members are going to ask you questions and discuss with you different aspects of your report. And the first one is
Thank you very much for your presentation. I think I like your presentation much more than the written document, because you have opted for a written thesis, which is the calculation of five particles. I must say that I like it. I mean, I don't like this whole, because you are entitled to do that, so I will not give you not influence my mind. But nevertheless, I find much more interesting some exposition like the one you have presented us orally than just the explanation of some articles. So I think that this explanation has been much more interesting and inspiring than this article that I have already read. Nevertheless, the introduction is, I found that it was quite good on explaining and the conclusions on the state. I have just one couple of questions which are maybe the same. Because both the methods, the experiments, and so on, I have confidence enough that the results are correct. So let us start by assuming that these results are correct in the same described things that are happening. How would you assess the influence that the samples we have taken are influencing the results of the experiment? I mean, what we have done is to ask for
Okay, can you repeat? Sorry.
what we have done is to ask for volunteers.
Yes.
And so we have a group of people.
Yeah.
What would happen if we have a different group of people? What, I mean, do you think that this experimental design, this sampling, this group of volunteers is influencing the results? This is something that I have in my mind since we did the first experiment. And the second question that I want to make is, if you have to design a new experiment today, what would you do to design this experiment, and what would you look for?
For the second one, do you mean that if I have to perform a new experiment, but in which the highest it doesn't matter?
Low density region. Well, it does. I mean, this is valid both for the case of the obstacle and for the case of the counterclockwise vortex region.
Okay. I think I have to divide my answer into two cases. Okay, for the high density scenarios, actually you performed the experiments and you were really conscious about it, because for the bottleneck case, it is true that there are a lot of, how to say, fluctuations, okay, especially in the flow behavior. So because of this, you perform not just one but several repetitions of the same experiments, and not just with one type of people, but with different types of people, namely students and militants as well. And in both cases, you found at least that the fast is a lower phenomenon, and also that the obstacle never improved the flow. So I would say that for the high density scenarios, you have enough statistic to, so to say, establish well-grounded, or at least statistically well-grounded conclusions. Okay? So I would say that if you change the people that you are using, if you reproduce the same experiment instead of, or if you are able to achieve the same experimental conditions as in the previous experiment, I guess that you will obtain the same results. With the same experimental conditions, I mean the same level of density, same level of RAS, and these kind of things. However, for the low density conditions, I think that people actually is playing a role. Okay, here, because at least for vortex formation, I'm not sure, even though the Silverberg board, they say that regardless of the traffic rules in the country, the vortex is always formed in the counterclockwise direction. It would be really nice to perform an experiment with people in the UK or the people in Australia or whatever. Okay. So in this particular case, I would say that yes, this will affect the people that you're choosing. Or for instance, instead of using adults, you use kids, where they probably don't develop a social rule inside. They don't behave like adults, or they don't. I don't really know what I would expect, but the results could be really different. And if I have to do an experiment now, regardless of its high densities or low densities, I would say that the most important thing here is performing several repetitions to obtain statistically significant results. That's basically all. I don't know if I answer your question.
That's what I was.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, that's all.
So now I think it's the turn of Dr. Claudio Pizzani.
Yes, please. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we can. Probably.
Is it clear? Okay. Nice presentation. I was quite impressed by the fact that so you managed to start with high density crowds and focus on that, even if like there was COVID and you were not able to do what you wanted to do, you didn't give up. You just didn't went into like some review paper, but you brought advantage of the situation to do something new and to also find something very interesting. And also, very much the fact that so you did experiments, you had some hypotheses, and you did some numerical model to verify the hypothesis, and then went back to the experiments. So I like very much this process of like moving from one side to the other.
Thank you.
And so my question is somehow similar to the one of Axel. So you did some experiments with high density and low density, and for both cases you have to build a specific model which were able to reproduce the mechanism that you showed at high and low densities.
Yes.
So do you think it's possible to actually build some model which can work for low and high density? And if which kind of understanding, which kind of knowledge we miss to have a model which can work in both conditions?
Thank you for the question. Really interesting, Claudio. Actually, I've been discussing with Alexander Nicolas a lot about it because we want to provide a model that will be able to work in both extreme scenarios. But I think that it's how can I explain this? There are different interactions working in, as you may know, different interactions of actually the different levels working. One in low density scenarios and the other in high density scenarios as well. So merging the different levels, okay, of simulations is not easy at first glance or as a first step. So I think that as far as I know, the starting point could be to try to merge, let's say, a decisional layer first that could be useful for the low density scenarios, okay, and which barely, merge a decisional layer with a mechanical layer, okay? Try to merge both ingredients in just one model. And it would be useful because for low density scenarios, the mechanical layer in principle barely comes into play, so the decisional layer will be dominate the system. And when the mechanical layer starts to appear in high density scenarios, you will be able also to reproduce at least qualitatively some of the results you are finding in the experiment. So I would say yes, but it's not easiest. It's not commonly used in pedestrian dynamics, as you know. That usually we focus on just one specific regime, or we apply the models in just one specific regime. That instead of try to grow the whole density regime.
Okay. Then, so I think you answered my question. Then I have a question based on your answer, which was very good. So do you think the model that you proposed, so behavioral models of decision-making based and one based on the process, this kind of approach could be done with the model we have, or we need a completely new model? I'm not asking you which model we need, because do you think it's possible to do it with the models we have, or we need something new that nobody's been?
No, I think I think we can with the models we have today, we can try to get both elements. Actually, it is not in my thesis, but Alexander and I was working in this particular model because we are trying, based on an energy-based framework, trying to obtain from or propose a well-grounded behavior, how can I say, decisional layer, and then Also, since we are working with energies, we can develop from the forces that are usually used in the high-density models, like the social force model. We can obtain the potential of the energy associated with this force and include it in a mechanical layer. So I think that yes, we can. We are able actually today to try to combine both elements. Yes.
Okay. Do you have time for a last question? Or?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Please proceed, yes.
Okay, so my last question is about the obstacle.
Okay.
So you showed that also I know that the obstacle is working in some special condition, then it's not working in other condition. Then so it is useful to reduce the pressure, but then it's not good from other perspective. So do you think there is some optimal configuration and location of the obstacle for a given scenario which may work? Or so how do you think would that be possible to find out what is the optimal configuration and whether it makes sense or not?
Okay, I would say yes. I think that you can always find a configuration, a weak configuration in which the obstacle improves the flow. But to be honest, it's not practical. At least the way as a physicist, the way I'm facing the problems is just not trying to find the specific condition at which the obstacle works, and instead I want to study the dynamical response of the obstacle as a whole. Okay, instead of focusing in a specific region in which the obstacle finds. And actually, from an applied point of view, it's not could be practical. Or, of course, to improve the evacuation process. But we have to be really careful about the psychological factors that I said in the presentation that the obstacle could have, okay, with the screening effects. And actually, I don't know, even, and probably you can tell me about it, that in Japan or in China, this kind of techniques has been used or not. But in Europe, I'm not conscious of any experimental or real system in which the has been used. Okay.
No, I think in Japan it's not used.
Not even used.
I heard about pedestrian roundabouts in China.
Okay.
But that's a bit different. So it's not really the obstacle for the bottlenecks roundabout, which is similar to traffic.
Okay. Thank you for the questions, Claudia.
Okay, so now our minister of no.
Yes.
Sorry.
So thanks for the talk, Iñaki. I think that I'd like also for the remark. I think it's the first time in 2019 in this place.
Yeah.
And then shortly the pandemic started, and then now immediately after the pandemic, and I was asking myself all the time, since you are doing high density research, that somehow are in trouble.
Yeah.
But then when I read you, I thought, okay, to manage to find a very creative solution for that, and then the result was very interesting. So I have a couple of questions. Okay. So actually, a lot of questions, but I will try to summarize maybe in that.
Yeah. Good.
But so the first part when you work on the obstacle, I found this is very great decision that you tackle this problem because it's controversial. Lots of people in the community, some say it's nonsense, some say it's interesting, and then you start working on it. So for the modeling part, you to model this and in a good way conform to the experimental result. You said also in your pitch in the theories that it didn't work well, and then I thought there are two factors that you use. One that you were not clear for me at that one. Okay, we think about. So the first is the interaction with the worlds is very important.
In the simulation, the boundaries effect is playing a key role in the
and you have also to tell people where is the goal to go, the E0 direction.
Yeah.
Velocity, because you have a wall now and and there is this talk that you introduced. So my question would be, what if you don't have a talk? You don't use in talk, just the direction is just speed. And how did you assign goal for everyone at every time? And the second question, and the last question would be, why did you think about coming up with a specific model for the walls and not just take the same force for the pedestrians and use it for the walls? So it's, for me, it's like, it's not like a specific model for the walls. So I want just to ask you if you thought about it, or was it not so important?
Okay, thank you. Motion for the question. Let me, I think this is very useful. So let me start by the last question. Okay, so the interactions with the wall, yeah, they are actually important. Boundaries conditions are really important in this particular problem. And I'm actually using the same contact force and contact torque for the interaction with the wall, the same scan. Okay? But you are right that maybe it could be interesting trying to see whether in the actual experiments is there any difference between interaction against pedestrians and against the wall. But experimentally we don't have data about it. Okay, so that's why we prefer leaving it aside and just working with the same.
Sorry.
Yeah.
For the second part, you put a lot of effort.
Yeah.
In
Yeah, you're right. You're right.
Because that was very important for this.
Yeah, you are totally right. No. We don't. On this particular point, we don't make such an effort to understand it. And the first question was, what would happen if we don't include, correct me if I'm wrong, the torque in the driving torque? How can I assign direction?
You just the pedestrians.
Yeah.
Just moving with the direction.
Yes, we basically here, for instance, let me show you this video. With the direction of the speed here, we have the driving force. Forget about the torques. We have the driving force. So it will govern basically the dynamics. So this diagram of this particle here, they just want to reach the. Let me speak briefly, but it's more complicated. But imagine that you have this particular target, so you just have this driving force acting in that direction, and essentially the rotational movement, since you are not including this driving torque, pedestrians behave as a sort of granular matter. Okay, so they are inert in the sense of motion, and that's why actually we are obtaining this particular behavior here with okay, the similar trend is observed basically because we are not including the rotational mechanism, so they are like granular matter, and the only thing that changes between this experimental system and this one is the driving force, and in this case is gravity, and this case is the desired speed. So
that makes sense. I think this is better idea than just to take the speed. I just wanted to know if you investigated the differences.
No.
And what about the design?
Sorry?
The goal of the pedestrian.
Sorry, can you?
What about the goal?
The goal, how is defined?
Zero. How do you define zero?
It's just a segment that goes from 80% of the door width, and you just reach the closest, given the position of the pedestrian, the closest of the shortest path to the edge.
But you have an obstacle.
Here, if you have an obstacle, no, they go straight. They don't see the obstacle. We don't include avoidance maneuver to the edge. So yes, actually, we don't follow the Daniel Parisi work.
Do I have time for one question? So for this, okay. So for the second part now.
Yes.
You kind of complained if you wrote about that 50% of people the distance is always below the cross-car distance. So here I had I was thinking, I'm not sure why this is because we human beings, we don't actually know what is 2 meters and what is 1.5, what is 1.2. I cannot tell you.
Okay.
So is it one reason? Is it?
Could be, but to prevent that this effect would be important. I don't know if we get it or not. Here you can see the black crosses here, and they accidentally walk by one of the crosses at the beginning of the experiments, lead some seconds to identify the distance that they should maintain just as a reference, okay? And they so probably yes, since we really used to walk in such condition, we don't know how to keep this.
Yes, this is what I was also thing? Is it because people they are forced to violate this prescribed distance, or because out of ignorance they don't know? You know. So, for example, if you take the question of Ahmed, if you repeat this experiment,
Yes.
next year, so to say, and then you train those people before, like one by one, you train them. So
How
that
do you
you
train
know what is 2 meters,
okay.
what's 1 point, you know, like training, and then start to simulate the experiment. Do you expect 50% of them will violate?
I expect high performance experiment next year. I expect that even more people would present social distance, because we don't. It seems that the COVID-19 pandemic has passed away or has passed. I think that we are more used to keep a smaller distance, or the interpersonal distance that we usually maintain is less than these 2 meters, of course. And we are ignorant, actually. I think.
Not because they are forced, not because of the identity force you to come.
Yes.
This is one reason, but that's not the point here.
That's not point, because in all these situations, we can include more people respecting the social distance. So the initial position at which every space to walk respecting the social distance. Okay. I mean, for the 2 meters experiments, we can include in the system with an hexagonal lattice, like I would remember 35 or 32 pedestrian size. So we are always below this threshold, because we wanted to know whether it was any density value at which they were always able to respect the social distance.
Okay. One more. So this, I have a question that I don't know answers on. Hoping you can maybe have. So I know you are like using a lot of heavy models and trying to make them a little bit better and tweaking them. It's okay, it's fine. But you take a velocity-based model. Do you think it helps or it doesn't? It has to be a force.
It could be useful to change the framework, the numerical framework. I'm, so to say, a little bit biased, because I understand easily a force-based model, because it's more natural for me than a velocity-based model. But you are, at least for low-density scenarios, for me it makes more sense to apply it instead of a force-based model, because it doesn't make sense that several forces are acting in our daily life. Okay, it doesn't make sense that instead it's more, it's logical to think that the velocity-based model, you want to go to a specific direction and with a certain velocity. And it's more straightforward implemented in a velocity-based model than in a force-based model.
In the first part, you say the social force part, I will just eliminate it. It's not important. But in the second part, oh, this is important.
Yes, I use this. I wanted to let's say that we have the Helmholtz model, which is the model that I use as the base, and then identify for each particular situation which elements are important. So that's why in the high density scenarios the social force doesn't make sense. In the low density scenarios, and actually the physical distancing scenarios, contacts are not important, so that's why we remove it. And also this in this situation the social force is actually important, because we have to maintain the interpersonal.
I think this is very nice point that you made also in the book, that we don't see in the literature. People just take the whole and we use it always in all the scenarios, even if it doesn't make sense. As you say, sometimes it makes sense to use this force, but not the other one. So you are more selective, which is, I think,
but you are totally right, Machine, that sometimes instead of saying it's better using this force or this force, maybe it's more wise to say it's better using this model instead of the other one. Maybe. Thank you.
So now is the turn of Professor Parisi.
Okay. Sorry, the camera was moved.
Oh yes. Sorry, Daniel. I wanted Flavio and you to see the tribunal.
Okay.
Now.
A little bit more left for me, so to see the screen.
Okay. Yes. So.
Okay. Well, first, I want to say congratulations for your work to you and your lectors also. It's a huge contribution. Many 5 papers is a lot of work, and also as Claudio pointed out, you turn the COVID crisis into an opportunity. So congratulations for this these ideas of testing new questions.
Thank you.
So great work. Now I just want to ask you about the experiment and simulations about the eggless with obstacles. If you can
This?
put down, yes, still I'm not. Well, you can.
Sorry?
Still, I want make a point over the presentation. I still not go in the presentation. Only the question is what are the common points between the simulation and experiment in the case of the obstacle? If you in the experiments in the simulations can reproduce some aspect of the experiment and which was it?
Okay. This is one key critical point for the numerical model, because one of the key features that is observed experimentally when you are present is the transversal waves. And our model is not able, actually, our model is not able to reproduce such behavior. With respect to the obstacle, it is also true that, as if I remember, Machine said, we are not including any sort of avoidance maneuvers between the agents and the obstacle when the agents are behind the obstacle. So that's another point of criticism. But for the rest, I think that since we are now including a closer particle, the particle shape of this model is more close or closer to the real human shape, and we are making this effort to provide good rotational movement with, let's say, physical sense. Our model is, of course, we know that it's not good enough, and probably I don't know if we are going to be able to obtain a numerical model enough good to reproduce the experimental findings, but I think we are going in a good way with this new numerical approach.
Okay, but there is some observable that you could reproduce.
The compare, for instance, the flow, the outflow in the experiments. Let me present here the outflow in the experiments. Let me check it because I write it down. It was the outflow in the experiments was around 2.7 person per square meter, but we have to be careful because it is not restricted. It's not a specific flow. I mean, it is not restricted by the door width. That for the experiments was a little bit short. Okay. For the particular case of our simulations, we use a small widely door just to prevent the formation of long clocks that last flow forward. Okay, so the outflow was around 2.7 or something like this pedestrians per square meter. So at least we can identify a set of parameters which are able to reproduce the same outflow. But to be honest, I don't know if we are in the same situation. Meaning that I don't know if you are seeing that you are watching the slide. Here, this particular value is around, or a desired speed value of 1.5 meters. That normally in the numerical community is not actually a high competitiveness scenario. So I don't know if we are reproducing the competitiveness in a good manner or not. And this opened a new line of discussion related with the driving turn and so on. I write something in the PhD manuscript, but I don't know if we'll have time to discuss a lot about it. So that's the only reference points that we have.
Perfect. Okay, so I have to point out that the shape of the particles seem not enough for reproducing the no increase in the flow with the obstacles present.
Yes.
So there is a very recent article in granular matters that they find the same, that an obstacle does not increase
Yes.
the flow rate, but the particles are very soft.
Yes.
In this case. So I ask you, your particle, which is the, yes, perfect. It is well for the contact equation, which you use for the linear was a high value.
Yes. 10 to the power of 5, if I remember correctly, that corresponds to coming from the granular field corresponds to hard dips, basically, to avoid overlaps
Yes.
greater than 1% or something like this. Yes. So actually, you are right that we are simulating perhaps really the particles with high stiffness, or that the deformation is not in the experiments, in the real experiments, the deformation is bigger and is playing also is playing an important role. And that's why it could be, and that could explain why the scenarios, and thank you for the paper, by the way, that you sent us, is observing that the obstacle in the granular case is not improving this time the output. Because maybe since they are using soft particles, they can, the overlaps are, in this particular case, really important, and the obstacle role could be minimal. So if we want to produce softer particles, we should change the K parameter here in the contact force. Yeah.
Yes, that will be very easy to do, and perhaps you can reproduce the hypno influence on the flow.
Yeah, you're right.
Okay. And now I'm very surprised because of the symmetry breaking, the last part of the thesis. I also congratulations for the discovery, because this is a totally different phenomenon. And in the slide 61, I want to make a question.
Yes, this one.
Yes, when did you observe the previous one, the one with the movie?
The one with the movie that turned, maybe it's this movie?
This one, yes.
Okay.
Well, if you identify one pedestrian, and if you have look at if the same pedestrian always make the same.
Yes,
turn.
we identify a total of around 150 different turns performed with different pedestrians. Basically, because in each repetition performed for every experimental condition, we use different pedestrians. And we identify that this kind of turns, for given a certain experimental condition, we find these turns in different repetitions for the same experiment. So it means that the turn is not producing always by the same pedestrian.
No, I mean, if you took pedestrian number 3, for example,
yes,
a particular pedestrian.
Yes.
Every time he or she faces the wall, he turns left.
Okay. Now I understand your question. No, we don't do this. Well, we don't identify whether the same pedestrian always performs the same turn. No. Just analyze individual turns regardless of the ID of the pedestrian.
Okay. So
but it's something, by the way, something we can do. Yeah, actually, it could be interesting. Just to say, just to see more clearly the turning preference of the pedestrian in the screen. The actual turning preference.
Maybe the second change depending on the situation, or always keep the same. So because of the new experiment you are doing, the reference of turning seems not to be the explanation for
No.
for the emergent behavior of the group. So there should be an influence of the other particles of the other pedestrian when you take this decision. Not just you at the well, if not you, and which happen with all other pedestrians also.
Yes. In fact, the last thing that we are thinking about is that maybe simulations, okay, about it, and the thing that I'm going to say, I don't know if it's quite clear, but probably this could be explained as a process of lake formation but applied in a circle, okay? That you have, there is a right size preference for people, but some conceptualize it as a sort of lane formation in applying a circle that eventually end up with a function. This is one point. And the point that you say is also actually important because now we are not including any, apart from the repulsion against the agents, we are not including any sort of blocking term between them, so they are not influenced. The decisions are not influenced by the others, just by the repulsion mechanisms. So, including us to see, well, in the numerical models, we are watching that the tuning preference is enough. So, from the experimental view, yeah, maybe the interactions with the rest of the distance is also playing an important point here.
Perfect. Well, finally, I would like to the final question of Mosin. You can still have a force-based model, but I suggest always to use the turning behavior and put in the driving behavior. You can always change the driving direction so that you make any evasive, elusive maneuver that you want. It's not necessary to have forces acting on the particle itself. It's only enough when change the driving direction. You can put the second layer for the driving direction.
Okay.
Do you understand?
Yeah. But for me, I mean, we can discuss a lot about it, but for me, trying to include all the decisional mechanisms in just one force it could be dangerous in the sense that at the end you don't actually know what is dominating the response of the pedestrians. Okay, I know that we can do, and there are several models that perform this. Musaid actually some of these type of models. But be able to differentiate between what is dominating in this particular scenario with this implementation is not straightforward. So,
in the real system, you only change direction by your decision through your self-driving mechanism.
yes.
You don't feel forces. So all the intelligence has output in the
driving force. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much. Congratulations again for the big quality work.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you as well for your help. Please, 4 years.
You're welcome.
Now I think it's my turn. I also want to publicly acknowledge the amount, not only the amount, also the quality of work that we've been doing during this year, despite the difficulties. And I think that this is something that is remarkable because I'm also used to deal with students, and the attitude is not always the same, and your attitude is probably very good during this 4 or even more years now that you've been doing work here at the department. Okay, now my question, I'm not working on pedestrians, I have never done any work on that, but I do know that I'm in animal motion, collective motion of animals, social animals. And I am going to ask you some questions that are sometimes suggestions. What I want to say, first of all, is that for me it was very useful that you did this 45 pages introduction, because without reading all the papers, it allowed me to have a view, and you did a great work on that, general view of what is the state of the art, the questions that actually remain to be answered. You have already answered your work over all these many years. But I must confess that I was a little bit frustrated, because from the point of view of the dense packings and the obstacle, and it was a little bit frustrating to see that despite all these many years of experiments with animals, with humans, with innovations of agents, of self-propelled particles, there is a little bit of a mess, right?
Indeed.
So, my question, like Angel was asking you a bit, imagine that you have all the resources, human and also family, to do experiments to try to clarify from the dense point of view and the obstacle point of view the state of it. So the conclusions regarding the behavior in these conditions. What will you do? What will be your dream experiment? If you have unlimited family resources and human resources as well to do as many times, what do you think needs to be done in order to put some order in the field?
Okay. Thank you for the question. The imaginary part of this thesis. So, if I could have free funding, the first thing that I did would be buying body pressure sensors for pedestrians, just to know how actually interactions between them, how the interaction between them actually is. Yeah. This is one point that is quite expensive. And also, I never, to be honest, I never think about it if I have reached what kind of.
Now I want to dream big. This is something that I wanted to tell you. So now you're going to start your career. You have to dream big. You have to get used to dream big. Then you can go small. But I mean, you have to dream very big. So you have to do this exercise. What would you like to do? Okay. And then, okay, because then the reality always is like that. Narrows you.
You want this, yeah.
But you have to be big, otherwise, if you start narrow, it will be nothing. Also.
Yes. So,
so it's difficult. It's a complex.
It's not this.
Probably it's not here and you can see,
Of course not.
That's also my impression after reading.
And to be honest, my experimental experience is not as long as Angel and Iker, probably. So I don't know if today I could identify some of the characters, but not all of them. So the first thing that I did probably will be surrounded by a great group of people. We just to the different limitations that characterize this type of systems.
Then another point is general, and I wanted to make with you regards modeling. Modeling, humans is something that when I was very much interested by this field of active matter and so on. I was a little bit scared about humans because we are able to think one thing,
yes,
and do the opposite. So this psychological thing that you are mentioning many times is very important. So really, I was also very pleased to see that you are trying to build some models that are not operational, as you call them, but also that include some decision making, which is very important. So for instance, myself and my husband and my family, if we go to a concert, they will stay to it. And I will try to see what is the room available in order to send shop, right? So I have to go there to the front, and I'm very good at finding route to be in the beginning. So this is an example, a stupid example to let you know that, to confirm you already know that humans are completely different ones from yours. Psychological factors and heterogeneity is crucial. So treating us like mechanical particles probably is not such a good idea. That's why I started working with animals, because animals are the same. They have also preferences, but probably they are more conditioned by survival and the ecology, natural laws, and probably they are not so weird as we are. And then, yeah, I wanted just to let you know that I had also the luck to be in the committee of the group of Javier Castillo for la Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona, where they do also these pedestrian approaches, by actually putting more weight to the part that is not mechanical, but to the part that is more decision making. And they use models to build free energy landscapes and information theory and also potentials that are related to prospection. So you have the ability to prospect, as I was saying, I'm able to see if I can sneak in, so you see a little bit what is the landscape, the configuration of humans, and I can prospect, and if I go that direction, I'm gonna manage to be at the front row, right?
Yeah.
So they do that, and I don't know if it can be helpful to look at their papers, if you know them, because in there actually they make this effort to build models in which a little bit more of statistical physics, like entropy, energy and landscapes and things like that you can use. We were talking about something that you are now.
It's not
Perfect. You don't, please look at some of
okay,
the work.
thank you. No, I've never heard about these guys. I think. No, probably yes, but it was a review or something like this. I don't know.
Yeah, the papers
Yeah.
and different aspects, but you will probably find
Okay.
the one that they have from pedestrians or one of the group has also done other works in the past. Yeah, from the point of view of modeling, I also wanted to say that I slightly disagree with you when you say that the social interactions are not important. I tend to disagree. Because, as I said, we are leaders, we are people, we are humans, and despite we are telling these people that are not participating in your experiment that they shouldn't copy, we are so social inside that for correlations, you will find correlations at short distances. They will imitate. It's something so natural in us, we learn by imitating. So you cannot really say, just behave randomly and this is what you are going to get. So I'm not sure if they are stupid, they are not able to preserve the 1 meter to the 2 meters distance, but I'm completely sure is that we imitate. And at least in short distances, of course, we also can prospect in the future, but at short distances, we imitate. So probably, one thing that you can do in your experiments is to try to establish correlations in the order. It's something that I was missing also a little bit in the development of your thesis, to measure correlations.
Yeah.
Correlations in the velocity, try to investigate a little bit polar order. That is going to be long range. It's going to be short range, and maybe that short range correlations that you can find can help you maybe to explain things, because there are many things in the thesis that you have actually observe and corroborate, but probably you cannot explain it, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to go slowly because I have many things and I don't want to mix everything together. But I wanted to say that a little bit of imaging that is crucial for this. And you know that for fish, and also ants, maybe they don't break the symmetry left and right, or counterclock and clockwise, but it is enough a little bit of imitation to be able to generate these vortex structures, vortex-like structures. And without the existence of walls. So just simulation to play with boundary conditions or predicts. Very boundary conditions also can play a role. We can argue many things, but I think that it is enough to put a little bit of imitation to actually generate these structures. Another issue is what happens with the counterclockwise symmetry and the breaking. This is something a little bit different from what you would expect. With my colleague, we have been actually looking at videos before the presentation in which we see the ants cycling, and ants actually rotate clockwise. We have seen also deer that actually protecting somebody that was weak in the middle and generating this vortex motion also clockwise, and they move both clockwise and clockwise. So connecting with this imitation thing and the experiment at low densities, and so my colleagues and Daniel less the last. Yeah, it will be really nice to see, not only when you face the wall, no, but when you move, what is your preference for turning,
Yes.
and see whether it is correlated with the preference for turning of the people that you have nearby. Because it's an optimization problem, right? I mean, we form lanes because we imitate, because that way we will actually be able to move faster.
Yes, yes, yes.
So that's
Right.
something that is in us. No, when we drive, when we walk, so it's gonna be probably something that is in my opinion.
Yeah, you're totally
You
right,
will-
Carmen.
you will
No,
tell
no,
me- you will
you're
tell
totally
me.
right. And in fact, I was discussing with Iker and Raul and Angel as well, because like usually we are not analyzing sort of correlation that will somehow say something about the interaction that pedestrians are having. So we start working on some correlation, radial distribution functions, for instance, of the velocities and this and this. But you are right. In order to provide a good or a more physically ground explanation, try to include the correlation between different magnitudes, of course, just to get a deeper insight of the actual dynamics, of the short range dynamics of pedestrians. So yes.
Yeah, and in this regard also connecting with theory, your things. So the idea is that maybe you also would like to make some connection at some point with the jamming that your colleagues and your familiar with jam and glassy systems in which they look for these correlations of dynamical quantities to try to identify maybe correlation lengths that are dynamic in nature. That can, for instance, explain if you observe that there is this distance that is optimal, especially for high packings, for dense packings. There is this distance of the obstacle that allows you to see an improvement made. And 1.2 meters, and what you checked was what was the influence of changing the size of the obstacle or the location of the obstacle. But I mean, what I will do as a statistical physicist is to try to see if there are correlation lengths that are comparable to that quantity.
A characteristic length, for instance,
Yeah,
right?
It's not only for the position. I mean, I will do it for the velocity itself in time to try to see if it's something dynamic.
Yes, yes.
Rather than just
Yes.
So this is a connection with the theory that we want to take. And also because I've seen that in the dense packing regime also you have variability. This is not the rule more than the exception. No? So you have no noise, you have no different behaviors, when you look at individuals. So this is also related to the fact that maybe it has to do with some transition as well, some dynamic transition. And in that language, this variability that we observe is perfect because we know that it has to be there. And in the connection with this, with the theory at this level, will a little bit perform added value, add value to the work.
To the explanation, yeah, sure. You're totally right, yes.
Okay, I'm sorry because I'm talking more than you, but I wanted to say it. But then I have also some questions that are maybe more questions. I mean, I haven't done any work on the field, but I have. For instance, rather than focusing on the obstacle, just one obstacle. I mean, if we go to the airport, they put some barriers, right? I mean, they know for sure, maybe just because they have it many times, that if they put some barriers and they ask us to go further, they get better performance. So have you tried maybe to just play a little bit around with more than one obstacle? I know that is a difficult question, but maybe more is better and easier than just one. If you put maybe a collection of points, obstacles that are separated, for instance, a characteristic distance, then the correlations and the size.
Sorry, Karen, for interrupt, but if you include more obstacles, I think that things are not more easier, or of course could be beneficial in the long term, but you are increasing the number of 3 degrees in your system. Because you are now facing, instead of using one, if you include 2, you have to play with 2 distance that characterize the distance for the one obstacle and the other. What is the relation between the size of the
Because you try not to do different size obstacles and you didn't see any correlation, no, with the
Yes.
heat and the size, no? I'm right?
Yeah, in the solutions, yes.
So now, I mean, now that we have discovered the fact that the size is also important, the location is important, and now if the location is important, try to see what happens if you put two obstacles at the distance that actually is the distance that actually favors the
optimal
flow,
distance,
and
yes.
you measure with respect to the wall. No. What I'm just trying to say is that I mean, you have several obstacles, then the correlations that you have measured that maybe are important are carried off by the fact that you have a given distance between the obstacles. We break a little bit on these correlations that you might have. And if it's due to the fact that you have correlations, now you have to observe that the distance in between the obstacles may replace that distance that is optimal when you only have one.
Yes, probably when since we are observing that for just one obstacle, the spatial distribution of the maps, both the density, velocity, and so on, completely changed. I'm pretty sure that if you include two obstacles, I don't mind if it's at the optimal distance or not. Again, the spatial distribution will be different not only from the no obstacle case, but also from the one obstacle case. And this induced that probably the correlation, both the spatial and dynamical correlation, will be totally different. So
Maybe
yes.
can influence.
Can influence, yeah. You can see, of course, like you said, that the cutoff of these distributions or observing other behaviors that with just one obstacle you are not able to observe because they are in the shadows, for instance, because you are using one obstacle. So
On the other hand, I mean, at the level of the models, when you make this effort to penalize the fact that you are reoriented in a way that is not a desired one, with respect to the X, I think that it's maybe a little bit more indirect way of again taking into account something that is more natural, that is just imitation. Because the ones that are close, they will do that, and then you will imitate, and with that actually you are already making easy the fact that you are progressing towards the exit. So I think that it is a little bit more indirect to try to do what you have done. I understand what is the spirit of the model, but I would find more natural to keep the blocking part, and you do that job for you.
okay.
Okay. I'm not sure if it's correct. I have here 2 pages of questions, but I'm not going to worry.
For the lunch, please.
Yeah, another suggestion that I think that maybe, or comment that I wanted to make to you is that these days that you have all this information on the YouTube and so on, rather than maybe designing yourself the experiments, like the paper of Seth and the other co-workers regarding the hard rock, and try to analyze situations in which people are not aware that they are part of an experiment, just analyzing it from YouTube, from videos.
Empirical experiments, like in normal situations, we have not analyzed any things like
Would
this.
you like to do that at some point? Do you foresee anything difficult?
Of course. But sometimes it's quite difficult to perform. Probably the tracking of pedestrians. From technical reasons, usually you don't want to have pedestrians influence or that they know that they are participating in an experiment. The tracking of pedestrians is quite difficult to be performed. So that's why we usually use control laboratory experiments that we know that probably the influence of pedestrians in these control laboratory experiments are not the real ones, and probably yes they are. Since once the people know that they are participating in experiments, their behavior are a little bit different from the real.
Yes, we use data if the people are not aware that they are being registered.
Yes.
Or the people, but maybe you can, now that you are saying that the schools, it's like that, you can put your cameras on the
Yes.
kids, and I disagree, the kids are more social than the adults. They imitate very much, they run one after the other.
Really?
Be aware of that, yes. I mean, the people go one after
Yeah.
the other, they don't want to be alone. Which one copy, very much. But these kinds of scenarios, without them being conscious, not being recorded, I think it is more interesting than having people that are conditioned by the fact that they are not yourself in their behavior.
Yes,
And
totally.
I would like to see their systems from other people. The same people, they turn to the same direction. constantly, I'm not sure again.
Yes. Actually, there is one guy in the pedestrian community, for example, who they usually analyze real scenarios. Not tracking the actual people. There is another problem related with the face recognition and the personal data. Okay, so they usually use infrared for one of the or deep image to perform the tracking. So this could be a really nice approach to analyze such system.
They will have to think about it.
Yeah.
And then if you want to compare with your results so far, I think that the best probably scenario will be using robots, right? That are more mechanical.
Yes.
So I hope that we will be able to collaborate in the near future because so far, no, probably for the evacuation problems and so on, or there are not so many, or million.
No, actually not. No. At least, as far as I know,
They
there's
won't
no
have
so many.
those conditions, not those trainings or those preferences and that heterogeneity that we were commenting about. So probably it's more natural, experiment to compare.
Yeah.
See if I have anything else that. Yeah, another that I wanted to comment is that maybe have you tried to look at pressure density, like if you were emissions of state, when you measure the pressure and the density, the local, have you tried to relate them and see if you have equations of the state for this dense gas?
Yeah, but it's, the problem with the equation, providing an equation of the state is that probably has to be in a stationary state, and the fluctuations here are, as you have seen, not only in the pressure values but also in the flow values, the fluctuations really determine the dynamical response. So thinking of a state equation,
People are doing ants.
really bad, but the ants are able to achieve, let's say, a stationary state.
I think that you have a stationary state, your things that is jerky stationary state, but it is a stationary state. It's not that things are evolving too much in time. Again, you have no curves that are flat with a lot of noise, but it's not that they are flat. I mean, most of the times, apart from a transient, it's flat, Or you don't agree with that?
Yes, but so you're using a finite system, like you say, you have an initial and final transition state, and probably I'm not really sure if we are able to achieve the stationary state in this particular scenario. To
Any
be honest.
simulations that you do?
Yes, with the stationary state, we implement periodic boundary conditions and wait until the stationary state, both in the flow has been reached. Yes.
Yeah, I have many more curiosities because also the power laws that you observe and everything that I is to reframe myself. So there was the distribution of the time lapses.
Yes.
I saw that you passed from the 0.6 to the 1.2 density, right? I mean, let me see, because distances between 0.6 and 1.2. The highest desired velocities. Yeah, it's because you have separation that seems to be not one, not the 0.6 if I'm not remembering.
Yes, for the obstacle distance.
2.12.
In the thesis?
I saw it in the presentation, but it's in the report.
In the report, which page? Carmen?
Very, I don't know, figure 212. So it has to
Okay,
be
so it has to
chapter
be in
6.
chapter 2.
And then I mean, these are simulation results, right?
2 point. So.
Sorry for that, because
No,
I didn't
it's okay.
write the page. But I was told, yeah.
Yeah.
So you see a separation on the rightmost here at the highest velocities that you want to
Yes.
have in there, desired velocity. You see a separation in between 0.6 and 1.2 that is very dramatic. The others actually all that goes on its own, and actually it's more interesting from the point of view of the exponent and so on and so forth. What will happen if you have some value in between? It will go smoothly decaying towards everybody together, or it will actually.
I think that it will make a jump. It doesn't be a smooth transition basically because here, the geometrical aspect between, or the distance between the obstacle and the door edge is the characteristic length. Okay, so pretty similar to the width of pedestrian. So once you jump from this characteristic length, this transition goes also jump.
That's interesting. Very interesting.
And I expected this, but I
I
don't.
can see. And another thing that I wanted to comment is that that information, of course, because you don't have those many repetitions at the level of experiments, you don't have these distributions that are more informative than just to look at flow rates. I mean, the distribution of the types is very much more informative.
Yes.
But you don't have that at the level of experiments, I'm afraid, because you don't have enough statistics to provide.
Yeah, that's why we usually use the survival conditions, mainly because of the
And
lack
your
of
dream
statistics.
will have to be also to have
Enough statistics to perform 100 experiments.
Yes, we have that thing. So thank you very much to all of you. And now I don't have to forget that I have to ask if there is anybody in the audience that is a doctor, has a PhD, if he, she wants to ask a question. I mean, is there time to do it? Otherwise, you. So if nobody wants to ask any question at this point, I ask you please to go outside and wait for our delivery. And you will be able to be back maybe in about 5 to 10 minutes. Oh yeah, Raúl and maybe you can stay with us a little bit. Okay.